Okay, thank you very much. And thank you very much, firstly, Paul, for the invitation to present as part of the Common Good project. So in keeping in line with our discussions that we had, I've titled the talk Post-Secularism in Australia and Seeking the Common Good. And so to begin, what I'd like to do, if I actually put that on presenter view, is I'd like to sort of just set the contours and step through a variety of developments that have taken place in recent years. And so the first thing I want to do is just say that Australia is actually many things all at once. So it's quite complicated in the sense that Australia, firstly, is increasingly secular. And that's not just in terms of separation of religion and the state, but Australia is becoming increasingly secular at the individual level, which is reflected in the census. And as a result of that, Australia is also now becoming post-Christian. And this is by virtue of the fact that Christianity has been steadily declining across all denominations. Up until I think the 2016 census, it was only the evangelical cohort that was increasing, which was about around 3%. But that's since the most latest census data in 2020 has also now, as we'll see, had a slight decline as well. So this means that we're moving into post-Christian, where there's almost, as we'll see, parity between non-religionists and Christians. So whereas Christianity has always been a majority, that is no longer the case, having fallen under 50% in the latest census polling. So alongside this, we also have Australia as post-secular. And what do we mean by this is the fact that now we have also religious diversity in Australia, and that's increasing and continually increasing with each census, thanks to migration and so forth, because people are now coming here, are religious, and they're bringing their faith and not resigning from their faith. And of course, I guess Australia's multicultural approach also helps with that development. And of course, I think the fourth part, which is sort of, I'll be posing something of a question, is that Australia now is potentially post-secular or becoming Christian again. And that will become clear, hopefully, as I move through. But that's to do with the fact that there are multiple things happening at multiple levels. And so what I'd like to do now, that having sort of outlined the strands, I want to unpack these a little bit. And in doing that, I just want to also provide some context as to how these can all be happening at the same time. For a long time, many, as you know, would have adhered to the notion of modernization, which is read as technological development and reason. And this has led to the idea was this would lead to increased secularization, and then religion would fade from the public sphere and become effectively a private matter. And this was put forward by many 19th and 20th century thinkers, of course, Durkheim, Weber, Marx, Freud, Nietzsche was also there, and you've got Berger and Luckmann, and particularly Berger, who was a major advocate for the secularization thesis, who we only lost a few years ago, back in 2017. However, it's become apparent that this idea that there was going to be sort of linear, uniform secularization was actually not the case. So whilst this took off from pretty much from the 1970s, particularly outside of sociology, picked up by many other disciplines, that's not become the case. And Berger actually ultimately recanted on the secularization thesis, and saying that the data just doesn't show this is actually what is transpiring. And he says, for while there has been some secularization in the West, it's not uniform. We're not seeing the same levels of secularization in all different geographical zones. Even in the West, for example, he talks about American exceptionalism. America has remained largely more religious than its Western counterparts, where we've seen very significant decline across Europe. It's not been the case. In America, I think from recent numbers, is still over 60 are still identifying as Christian in some way, shape or form. But there have been marked declines in the UK as well as in Australia. But alongside this, you also realise that there's geographical shift in terms of religion generally. So that where religion is placed is now in sub-Saharan Africa, particularly for evangelicals and for Muslims, and that due to birth rates, these are increasing. So he realised that the world was still as religious as it ever was, and he sort of talked about the demagification, the desecularization that was taking place. And so he said that basically we now need to map where this is taking place, and of course it's not uniform, so multiple things can be happening in multiple jurisdictions all at the same time. So it's not a linear process. So that's one element of why we can have multiple strands happening all at the same time. Alongside this, another useful concept to help us understand what is going on, I think, is Eisenstadt's concept of multiple modernities. And this has to do with, obviously, migration flows and greater interconnectedness, interaction between peoples. And this idea, according to Eisenstadt, presumes the best way to understand the contemporary world, indeed to explain the history of modernity, is to see a story of continual constitution and reconstitution of a multiplicity of cultural programs. And these ongoing reconstructions of multiple institutional and ideological patterns are carried forward by specific social actors in close connection with social, political, and intellectual activists, and also by social movements pursuing different programs of modernity, holding very different views of what makes societies modern. So in other words, there are different epistemologies or ways of being and knowing in the world that are happening at the same time. And so this is a counter also to the idea of secular Western modernization. And so what this means is, according to Eisenstadt and others, is that there effectively is a Christian worldview, there is a Buddhist worldview, there's a Hindu worldview, there's a Muslim worldview, and in fact, if we take it even further, we can see that there are a multiplicity of worldviews even within those faith traditions. And so you can sort of keep, going on and on and on in terms of iterations. So there's an incredible multiplicity. So you can have various different strands happening all at the same time due to these multiplicities of particular epistemological or ontological views. And of course, as I mentioned before, with globalization and mass migration, we're now finding these present in Australia. And of course, as people are migrating, they're not necessarily saying, of course, we don't really push the idea of assimilation, that they have to resile themselves from their religious worldview. So they can still have their cultural outlook, their religious outlook, alongside what is perhaps considered the dominant view. So that's another element which is important to keep in mind as we move through. Finally, in conjunction with both of these, there are different developments at different levels of Australian society, which Adam and I classified as the macro, namely the government level. Meso is the organizational institutional level, and at the micro and individual level. So these are all the different facets which are all intersecting and taking place at the same time, allowing for what is a very seemingly complex development where you can have all of these things coexisting with each other, namely being secular, post-Christian, post-secular, and potentially coming back around to being post-secular or Christianized again. So with that in mind, I now want to sort of step through some of the trends and how these relate to these developments. And I'll come to what I think is the policy challenge, again in line with the theme in dealing with this particular complex development. So what we see here is we have increasing secularity. So we can see that from the 1970s, as I said, that Christianity has been on a decline. So it's now in the last iteration of the census in 2021 at 43.9%. And we can see that pretty much, I think they changed the census around the time where they put a question in allowing you to say no religion or atheism, and as a result of that, we've actually seen a very stark and rapid rise of people claiming no religion. And I should put a caveat: this also includes agnosticism as well, both positive and negative, which is if you believe there might be a God or might not be a God. So it does include those other categories as well. But this general idea of not necessarily believing in a deity has risen quite significantly and is now almost at parity with Christianity. So we have a very, very large non-religious bloc. And indeed, the non-religious bloc now is actually, in some respects, the largest category when we deal with religion, because as at 38%, it's far and away above those of the others, such as Catholics now only constituting 20%, and Anglicans only 11%. And further, with a drop below 50%, as I said, Australia is no longer, I would say, nominally a Christian society. I mean, back in 1911, I think it was somewhere around 89 or 90% that people identified as being Christian. So somewhere on the continuum, people were identifying themselves as that. So there's been a steady decline, and now there is, as I said, it's a minority in relation to the other components that make up Australia's religious mix. So this means that we are an increasingly secular country. So we're also, as I said, post-Christian. And so what we can see here is that, again, we can see that Anglicans back in 1911 was 38.4%, and that's now dropped in 2016 to 13.3%. And you can see that Anglicans have actually had the sharpest decline in relation, losing, according to the latest figures from 16 to 21, another over 600,000. And you can see again also the Catholics have sort of fluctuated. This is partially to do to migration, where people have come in, but it's since dropped from 20.6 in 16 to 20%, and remains the largest category. And you can see the others, I think the Pentecostals, you can see actually went up, as I mentioned before, to 3.7, so they did have a slight increase, and this is because of some of the work of evangelical churches like Horizon and Hillsong. Yes, for some reason, I don't know why Horizon came to my mind first. Might be because of Morrison. And so that there was a slight uptick, but we've since now seen again with the Pentecostal, you can see just 4,000. So they're largely sort of holding firm with a strong focus on youth due to their sort of concert-like stadium sort of driven events. But generally now we can see in 2021 there has been a decline across all the categories, which is meaning that again, as we're moving into what was regarded as a post-Christian era. And you can also see that other religions have also been steadily increasing, leading to religious diversity and pluralism, which I have on the next slide. So what we have here, now we say we're post-secular, and this is because what we see now is we have Islam, which is 3.2%, that's 813,400, Hinduism at 684,000, 2.7%, and Buddhism at 615,000 at 2.4%, and Sikhism at 210,400 at 0.83. And this all constitutes 9.3%. Of course, there's the others that make up the remainder, which takes it up to 10%. So what's been happening, as you can see, is that these are just the four major ones, is that there has been a marked increase from, you can see, from 1996 up till now. And of course, in the Indian diaspora is one of the fastest growing diasporas in Australia. And hence we're having a rapid increase of those adhering to Hinduism as well as Sikhism. And I should say also that Islam is also moving at a fairly rapid rate due to high birth rate, and probably will be over 1 million, I would say, at the next census. So we'll continue to see that number climb. At the moment, it's a touch over 2.5 million people, but as I said, with migration, this will continue to increase, and we're going to become increasingly religiously diverse. Perhaps not super diverse as we'd use with Verdevec in terms of the way we have ethnic. I mean, just as an aside, I think within the Muslim community, there's 183 different countries which are represented within that particular milieu. So whilst you have super diversity, we're not quite there yet, but in terms of the diversity, it's going to continue to increase. So effectively, Australia is becoming a mix of secular, Christian, and wider religious diversity. So the non-religious are around 9.9 million, and Christians around 10.9 million. And so in terms of governance, I feel this presents a significant challenge now to how do we manage this sort of strange mix where we have at the individual level. I should emphasize this is at that micro level where people are making individual choices. As I'm pretty all aware of the move away from bricks and mortar institutions to individual and sort of almost bricolage in terms of people picking and choosing from different faith traditions. How do we manage this kind of diversity in our society, which seems increasingly fragmented across these different categories? And I think Habermas sums this up really quite well. He says there's the challenge of religious diversity, and he underlines that in plural settings, the challenge is to draw on delimitations between a positive liberty to practice a religion of one's own and the negative liberty to remain spared from the religious practice of others. So the challenge is that we have to have the right to actually practice our faith freely and not have others try to curtail that or impose theirs on us. So in other words, how do we work with post-secular society's religious tolerance in ways that celebrate religious diversity, but does not foreclose upon the freedom to be, for example, of another faith tradition, or indeed to be an atheist? And we have to remember, or agnostic, that this includes the non-religious category now as well, which is again the largest category. So there has to be this broader understanding where we have to sort of take into consideration their views, how do we engage with them, and how do we engage with the much more plural religious scene that is now part of the Australian mix. And so part of the solution for Habermas is to have neutral and secular governments that can ensure communities of various beliefs are able to coexist on an equal basis. I should put as an aside, there is a caveat that Habermas is often accused of asking the interlocutors to actually change from a religious register to a secular register, which means drop religious language and concepts, which I actually don't agree with. I think is highly problematic. I've written about this in the religion and aid space because I see the same thing happening in that space where religion is often seen as taboo. And I think that I would put a caveat saying that actually that each group needs to be able to speak in its own register in order to be understood from its perspective. Otherwise, you have a homogenizing effect and you lose, I think, understanding. So I would just add that to this idea. But I certainly think, yes, having a neutral and secular government, but then not necessarily blanching the language and having everyone have to speak in the same secular register. However, that said, I think this is where things get interesting and somewhat problematic in Australia from my particular view. For while we are meant to have the separation of church and state, this has actually been steadily eroded now over the last 25 to 30 years. And this is happening, I want to say, I'm not partisan, this is happening on both sides of the aisle. There might have been an instigator, which we'll see, but it's actually something which is both across the major parties. And this erosion is actually in favour of Christianity. So as I mentioned, foregrounded before, when we say we're post-secular, this is where this idea of the re-Christianisation is happening, but it's happening at that macro level, which has a knock-on effect for those other stratas that we talked about in terms of the meso, the institutional, organisational, and the individual. So to my mind, there's something of a paradox which is actually taking place at the moment in relation to religion, particularly with Christianity, which, as we've seen, is actually declining in terms of actual numbers of adherents, or those people that identify as Christian in some way, shape or form. And there's an outsized impact which is actually now happening in the political sphere. And that's at the government, or as I said, the macro level. So we're actually seeing a massive disconnect between the demographic changes that are happening and what's actually happening in our political representation and the elite discourse. And as I said, so this takes us to sort of a post-secular, and of course I should say, and I should actually also pay tribute to the late Marion Maddox, who wrote a lovely review of Religion and Change, who was actually one of the forebears, in terms of setting up my grounding for these particular topics. And her book, God Under Howard, is actually quite tour de force and quite magisterial. But it's speculated that the Liberal Party has around 40% adherence to Christianity, while in the Labor Party there's around 30% that identify as Christians. So we have a very strong representation of Christian faith in the two major political parties. And this outsized representation dates all the way back to John Howard. And John Howard actively courted the Christian vote, and this is where I'm indebted to the work of Marion Maddox, who paved the way for this. And she outlined this in her book, God Under Howard, which I recommend to anyone if you haven't read it. He was a member of the Lions Forum, which was described by Maddox as a crypto-Christian faction within the Liberal Party that was formed in 1992 by Senators John Herron and John Tierney, along with Alan Cadman, John Bradford, Chris Miles, Kevin Andrews, I'm sure is well known to everybody, and John Forrest from the lower house. And the agenda of the group was likened to that of America's religious right, and was couched in the language of family values. So often these groups would use coded language in order to, as I think at one stage John Howard himself said, to wink at the Christian community in terms of policies. And this particular group set forth a series of policy prescriptions that sought to entrench what was seen as the essential heterosexual nuclear family and to stop abortion. However, as I said, they use coded language and they would avoid overtly religious language so as not to upset the wider public. So they were very cognizant of the fact that they were dealing with this increasingly diverse mix, and they would look to use coded language to speak to the Christian community and signal that they were using Christian values, if you like, to direct their policies. And in 1996, election victory, the Liberal Party was seen and is reported to have reversed what was a long-standing trend between the two major parties. They turned what was a 9% deficit amongst Catholic voters into an 11% lead, and this lead was maintained in subsequent elections, of course, up till his eventual loss of his seat and the election in 2007. But it was actually this view which was seen and observed by the Labor Party that actually brought the Labor Party also back to the Christian community. So this actually precipitated a battle for what was seen as the Christian vote that saw Kevin Rudd himself in the Kevin 07 election turn to religion in a bid to counteract what they saw as the Liberal coalition's advantage. And people may or may not know that in doing so, he actually penned an article on Bonhoeffer in the monthly magazine and talked about how his ethics, of course, as a dissenter, was basically someone who drove him. Now, I don't think he was particularly outwardly religious, if you like, up until that point, So this was very much, I think, him looking to recraft his image from the sort of technocratic, almost boffin-like individual into a person that also had, a sort of a Christian element to him. And this was very much an attempt to try and take that ground away from John Howard, who had been seen to have basically sewn this up for a number of elections where Labor had basically fallen short quite significantly. And so what would happen as well is that as a result of this, they actually sort of part of the campaign in 2007 was actually a really staged all around Christian values. And at the press club, they actually had a whole webinar that they did to the Christian community. It was a webcast around 100,000 Christians during the election. And that was actually organised by the Australian Christian Lobby. There was, and around 200 Christian leaders were reported to be present to ask questions, and no less than some 700 churches were represented by the people that attended this particular event. And so basically this effectively solidified, if you like, this battle for the Christian vote at the federal level. And a really, really good example of how this solidified this particular development is the fact that when Julia Gillard came along, she didn't resile herself from religion. She made quite the quixotic statement on John Fane's radio program where she declared her atheism, because she was an avowed atheist. She said, "I'm not going to pretend a faith that I don't feel." However, at the same time, her policy approach was very much Christian oriented. So she continued to follow that party line of pursuing the Christian vote, despite the fact that she had presented herself as an avowed atheist. And a couple of good examples is that she actually funded the chaplaincy program to a quantum that was double of what Howard, who instituted the program, actually funded the program. So she pumped, in 2010, an injection of $222 million into the chaplaincy program. So for someone as an avowed atheist, this would seem like a strange policy choice to do. So this was speaking specifically to try and maintain what was now perceived gains with the Christian community as a voting bloc. Alongside this, it was actually characterized, and I should say, and this is where we start to see part of the disconnect. So when they put this funding in, it was described, and this is in The Guardian, as overwhelmingly a Christian jamboree. So it was predominantly targeted towards Christian schools, despite some Jewish and Muslim schools joining the program. So it was seen as very much, again, targeted at voting bloc. So whilst there was some representation, that was how it was reported. So again, it's speaking to the fact that this is sort of a campaign mode kind of policy. I should also mention further, in the lead up to the election, Gillard pledged $1.5 million to celebrate the canonization of Mary MacKillop. So again, which was for an avowed atheist, was again a strange choice. So she was very much keeping in line with this turn towards Christianity and pursuing the Christian bloc. So, and she also mentioned that she said the great contribution of the Church and Australian Catholics to the social fabric of our nation in relation to acknowledging that and in that pitch for canonisation. So despite her atheism, Christianity was very much front and centre and had a flow on, as we can see, to what we call the meso level, the institutional level, where they're supporting religious schools and associated organisations. So this then continued, and what we see is an uptick of this as a result of the fact that Labor's now come in and started to actually compete in this space. This actually allowed for more and more overt religious positioning within the political sphere. So much so that it actually allowed Abbott, who was previously regarded as the mad monk and seen as unelectable, to actually then come forth and actually win the election. And indeed, following Abbott's election in 2013, he's reported to have assembled one of the most religious frontbenchers in history of the Australian Parliament, with almost half of his cabinet being practicing Catholics. So this included both liberal and conservative, so you have people on the different sides of the spectrum, but nonetheless identifying as part of the wider Christian community. And those counted in the more liberal category included Malcolm Turnbull, who Abbott supplanted as leader, Christopher Pyne, George Brandis, and Joe Hockey, whilst the more religious group consisted of Kevin Andrews, again, who was there, as we know, from the beginning of the Lions Forum, Barnaby Joyce, Andrew Robb, and Matthias Cormann. And in addition to the Catholic contingent, the group also included non-Catholics in Erica Betts, who was from the Christian Reformed Church of Australia, and Scott Morrison, who, as we know, is aligned with the Pentecostal Australian Christian Churches group, formerly known as Assemblies of God, of which Horizon Church is a member. So effectively, what this allowed for was, again, religion to be much more front and center, because it had become a battleground, and this had normalized the place of Christianity in the political discourse. And of course, so I think this effectively also opened up the ground for Morrison, who was an evangelical, and I think what we might see is something of the apex of this particular development transpire with his ascendancy to the top job in a few years' time. And of course, this also culminated with his push for religious freedom. I should preface, though, that this wasn't something that came out of the blue. If you look, and I didn't have time to sort of go into the detail of the push, but Abbott and all these others, along with the conservative think tanks, have been pushing this idea of religious freedom for quite some time. So Morrison was also just, I think, the culmination of what is a long standing position that they wanted to pursue this particular item. And so Morrison sought to introduce a religious discrimination bill during his tenure. And so this was a very interesting and somewhat problematic bill. And clause 10 of the bill, which states that it is not a discrimination if a religious body conducts itself in a way that can reasonably be considered in accordance with the doctrines of religion. So basically it was saying that if something is in accordance with your doctrine, then it's okay for you to espouse that, which opened up a whole array of statements that could be made, not just in the Christian context, but of course in other religious contexts as well. Alongside this, the exposure bill also included an Israel Folau clause in its original iteration. Of course, that was subsequently removed after uproar. And in the subsections 3 and 4, wherein the employer with a value of 50 million or more can only impose a restriction on religious belief if it can prove that it is necessary as protection against unjustified financial hardship. And of course, this is because Israel Folau, who was an Australian rugby member, as people might know, stated openly in relation to, I think, his small but evangelical church that gay people were going to hell. And he put this out on social media. And of course, Qantas was a major sponsor of the Rugby Australia. And of course, at that time, the CEO, who was also from the LGBTI community, didn't take that well. And of course, he was sacked. And so this was an attempt to prevent that from happening again for undue financial hardship. And so through this clause, the proposed bill effectively, or both of these clauses, the bill provided grants or granted a positive right to religious organisations to discriminate on the basis of religion with a view to protecting their ethos. And as I said, this also potentially paved the way for individuals like Folau to be able to publicly declare things like gays are going to hell without any ramifications, particularly the financial ramifications, where a third party can put pressure and actually cancel your contract. Now, the Law Council noted that the bill could effectively been seen to legalise hate speech, and so this was where it was seen particularly problematic. And so, basically what this was seen as very much a Christian drive to legalise from their perspective what they felt were rights that were taken away from them, and they wanted to put that forward. However, again, I want to emphasize this is coming from the macro level. So remember, things are happening at the macro, the meso, and the micro. So this doesn't necessarily reflect what's happening at the individual level. And I'm actually very pleased to say that the bill was actually savaged by a coalition of religious leaders from both from Christian, Muslim, and Jewish communities who signed a letter that said it would be better to have no bill at all rather than what was on offer. And I think many of them agreed that this was opening up Pandora's box and was not particularly helpful. So again, what you've got a very different view at the micro level and at the meso level to what is happening at the macro level. So when I talk about post-secular, I think this is something which is coming from that different strata, which is that outsized representation at the political level, which is not necessarily listening very well to the other stratas, particularly the meso and the micro. So this was a drive, as I said, coming from one facet, which is leading to that sort of return of Christianity, and it's creating something of a disconnect, if you like, with the wider social sphere. So in coming to a conclusion, I want to come back to Habermas and agree that there needs to be dialogue that protects people's right to practice their faith, but does not force another's faith upon them. So there has to be that sort of egalitarian ethos. And in recent times, this has not been the case. As I said, I think rather Christianity, particularly at that macro level, is in the ascendancy. And this is to some extent feeding into the meso-institutional level through policy decisions, which is having an outsized benefit for one community above and beyond other religious communities. And that this is effectively at odds in part with the micro, because I can say, I haven't put slides in because I didn't have time, but for example, the Muslim community on which I work most predominantly has a wide array of NGOs and third sector organizations. And of course, as I was saying, we're seeing an outsized effect in terms of policy directed towards Christian organizations and not so much towards the other religious communities. So there's a disconnect at that institutional level as well as at the micro level. And in particular, it's at odds with the micro level where we have a surge in non-religion and burgeoning religious diversity. So in other words, there's a fundamental disconnect where policy is being driven largely by one worldview and is not engaging with other epistemologies or ways of knowing and being in the world. And as I said, this is again reflected by that coalition of Muslim, Jewish and Christian community leaders rejecting the religious discrimination bill with the view that it was creating, as I said, more problems than it was solving. And so to my mind, I guess this is my polemic for the end, is to say that there needs to be genuine dialogue at the community level, I think at a much more granular level, and there actually needs to be listening, and there needs to be more space for all those alternative voices to be heard within the political sphere. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, David. We've got a good 20 minutes for conversation with David, so I'll open the floor for questions or comments. Yes?
In addition to the three levels you talked about, the other level is that of social imaginary, and Charles Taylor has talked about this, the sort of taken for granted common sense view, what you talk about and what you can't talk about. And as you know, in the secular age, he's argued that secularisation, in addition to individual belief and in terms of church-state relations, is the shift away from a social imaginary where God was somehow taken for granted to one where God is an option extra. What I think is interesting, and the discussions about Taylor's book, is whether that social imaginary of a secular world, what he called immanent frame, that there's nothing beyond this material life, that's becoming more problematic. And so that's a different level to what you've been talking about. And my sense in Australia is we're very secular. Most public conversations that I've witnessed and hear about just assume that God is not really relevant, it's a personal belief. But the shifts that are taking place in the world are really ones where, as Taylor says about, he quotes Doris Day, is that all there is? That sort of sense that there must be more to life than just consumer satisfaction, GDP, and political stability, and so forth. So within the kind of secularity of public discourse, economic and political, there is this kind of emerging disease.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, look, that's very interesting. I mean, Berger initially said something similar to that, in the sense that there is this idea that the Abrahamic faiths sowed the seeds of its own destruction, in the sense that God became more remote, and that God is becoming more and more remote, because whereas previously people had more direct connection with the deities that they worshipped. And so, but I think in terms, there's some very interesting research which seems to suggest that people are indeed yearning for some more connection, and not just from those who are migrating here in terms of bringing their religions across, but there's particularly youth, Andrew Singleton and Halifoff and stuff have done on Gen Z. There seems to be a desire for people to try and find alternative forms of spirituality. And there's also what we've called bricolage, where people are now borrowing bits and pieces from different faith traditions and trying to make something that works for them. So I think that speaks to maybe a sense of, yes, wanting to find something more. Whilst they're disconnected from bricks and mortar institutions, there's still that sense of a need that needs to be filled by spirituality or religion. So yeah, we're seeing an uptick in people have what would be described as varied spiritual beliefs. Some people can hold up to 6 or 7 different spiritual strands at one time, according to the latest research. Does that sort of answer what you're coming at?
Yeah, I think there's a number of instances where, surprisingly, people who would be erstwhile totally secular kind of come out as believers. Like the Somali woman who was, I can't pronounce her name, but married to Niall Ferguson, who was you would know about her because she was
do you mean Ayaan Hirsi Ali?
Yeah. And then she in the end became a Christian, which is kind of amazing. like to Russell Brand and so forth. I mean, there's a real ambiguity about it because you can see the adoption of this kind of cultural shift being used by Christian nationalists, you know, like the likes of Tommy Robinson, and here in Australia, you know, the Liberal Party's adoption of Christianity, it has that same kind of utilitarian purpose, but nonetheless it does indicate there is something going on in our culture.
Oh no, there is. I mean, mentioning Tommy Robinson, I think it was in South Yarra, I saw Free Tommy Robinson graffitied on a wall.
Right.
So there is, in terms of, I mean, the far right movement is quite heterogeneous, but so not all of it, I think, is based around Christian identity, but there is, I think, a thread of exclusivism which runs through it, which is tied to white identity. So I don't want to taint all Christianity with all of that, but yes, there is certainly, particularly in the US, there's a strong connection, but yeah, I don't think that's not through all of the far right groups.
Just to pick this up, do you think that fits in within like this idea of post-secularism, what Anders said, like there's this kind of perhaps emerging dissonance and a grabbing out, but then also to me the way that you describe, like someone can pick 6 different strands, it sounds very familiar in that I can pick 6 different products off a shelf, or like the kind of base level neoliberalised subject remains strong, even though but that there is a reaching for this perhaps sort of vacuous idea of a post-secularism that we've seen at the in your macro level. Do you see that? Is there a connection?
There's also a whole body of work on the religious marketplace and the commercialization of these sorts of things as well. So that there's the discussions of yoga and how yoga is sold with sort of some degree of spirituality, but then a lot of the research is showing that most people that are doing it have no real understanding of the religious underpinnings of the practice. But some still might find that they say they have some more greater spiritual connection. Yeah, so there's that side of it, but I think coming back to what you were saying, there is for some people a yearning for something, a genuine spiritual connection, whether that's found in nature religion, whether that's found in Hinduism or Buddhism, or whether or not it's a hybridized version or a syncretic version of some form of Christianity mixed with other elements. Because there has been also research that shows that some people who might still be going to synagogue or still be going to church or occasionally going, are now bringing in other elements from other faith traditions to mix in with that. So we seem to be in a period of, as I said, cobbling things together at this particular time.
Yeah, there's in the United States, there's now a demographic category of evangelical Muslim.
Oh, okay.
So Muslim voters who resonate more with the right wing in the U.S. Now it's actually now a category that demographers are using, evangelical Muslim. I never thought I'd hear it.
Okay. Yes.
Well, this doesn't go against your argument relating to complexity, but when you're interpreting the census, I'm just got a few questions about this no religion category. I was reading an article in Christian Century in the US where, and I'm not sure what term actually used in the US census, but it was trying to break down the no religion category and about 5 different groups. But from memory, the biggest group was people who identified with Christianity. So no religion meant that a person didn't identify with a denomination. Didn't mean that there wasn't some broad, for a lot of people, identification with Christianity.
Where was this? What was the
In the US.
In the US.
So whether surveys and so on have been done here, I don't know. You know more about that.
Well, in the Australian census, the data is quite detailed. So you'll have people will actually choose agnostic.
Yeah, you've got that option, but you've also got the option no religion. I'm talking about no religion.
Well, I would be cautious about comparing the American context with the Australian.
Well, that's just an idea. I'm really raising a point that you'd need survey research probably to.
Well, I would warrant that probably needs qualitative research because you'd need to actually do.
Yeah, or both.
Yeah, you'd have to do interviews with people to try and get into how would they articulate that. I'm thinking that in the US context, again, because of what we regard as American exceptionalism, people still are fundamentally more religious than in Australia. I think it was in the church lifestyle survey, it was only 7% of people are regularly going to church. Whereas it's much, much higher in the US. I think it was, the last time I checked, it was 60% or more identifying as Christian in one denomination or another. So, I think the context there is very different. But I think that the census is set up in a very different way.
Yeah, I'm not saying it's exactly the same, but it was just made me think about.
No, it's possible.
What does no religion mean?
Well, there was some work that's been said there is some confusion. I think there's a particular scholar out of the UK who talks about how there is a lot of confusion about how to articulate, or what does no religion mean, what is agnosticism, and so people don't necessarily know what these terms are. So whether or not you're getting an accurate description of what the lay of the land is questionable, sure, but I would have to, I'd say I'd take it as homework, in the sense that I need to go and look at it, and actually, if I could do the field research to go, what does it mean? Are we seeing a similar trend in Australia? But it's an interesting observation. If people are understanding it as, no, I'm not aligning myself with the denomination, but I still see myself broadly as a Christian. Yeah.
Well, I had another point, if I may. When you're talking about the political impact of Christianity, more recently, really focusing on the what I call the Christian right, and aligning with the political right. And you mentioned Marion Maddox, but there's also like a Christian, should be a more liberal Christian. So it's a kind of Christian left. And when you're talking about political impact, I think it's a bit simple just to focus on, say, the Australian Christian lobby. And there's a distinction you can make between, with Christians active in politics, Christians trying to protect institutions, schools most obviously, the whole state aid issue, and you have certain moral issues like abortion, marriage equality, protecting the traditional family, that kind of thing. But you also have Christians, perhaps of a more liberal type, such as Marion Maddox, and I think of Brian Howe, who was Deputy Prime Minister under Keating, for most of Keating's Prime Ministership. Well, he would, and he's done work himself on influence of significant Methodist clerics going way back. So he wouldn't focus so much on protecting the church's institutional interests, but how Christians can have an influence on, social policy, areas like that, foreign policy.
Well, I think
engagement with Asia. So how do you? So I think it's a little bit simple. Well, you should pay attention to the impact of the Christian right, but I like to see the other end of the spectrum being considered too.
I think that's a fair point, but I would say that one of the challenges is that the what you might say is the more sensible left, the liberal in that sense, are being drowned out by the right. So often they are captured. I mean, I think Turnbull, who was seen as more on the open side of it, was basically undone by the plebiscite on same-sex marriage. He was undermined by the right. Nicky Sava's got a terrific book on this, where basically he was white-anted by Abbott and others as a result of what he did, and I think it was Brandis and others were scheming on how do we draw this out to actually make it a non-issue and go away. And so the postal plebiscite was actually this sort of compromise ground to do that. So the challenge is that they are strong-armed by the right, and often the political parties are captured by the right. I think there's been, at the state level as well, there's been a capture of certain regional branches of the Liberal Party by particular Christian groups. So it's a real challenge for, I think, those more broader social policy-minded people to be able to have sway.
Yeah,
Yeah.
sure. I mean, it's
So it's
an
an arm
issue
wrestle.
with the exclusive brethren,
Mm.
for example, and
Yeah.
also Mormons trying to have more influence in the Liberal Party.
Paul?
This is a question that relates a bit to your three categories, like the top bit and the meso and all that. And since we started the Common Good Project, I think originally we probably began as thinking sort of, oh well, can the Christian denominations sort of gather together to share, their approaches to the common good. We quickly realised, as your figures are showing, we're now in a multi-faith setup, and so rather than thinking of ecumenism, that's one part, but you must think it in terms of multi-faith. And and you do hear like there's some sort of policy agenda, political agenda about social cohesion, and they're worried about it. And there have been attempts to set up multi-faith at the meso level, bring them all together when they meet and they talk. Bruce was at one yesterday, multi-faith organisations. So is there anything promising stirring at the meso level there that might bring a much broader approach to the different faiths towards the common good?
I think that stuff's important. It really is. Having been involved in some of those myself over the years. But one of the things I've seen, and I'm drawing on my experience of doing a lot of field work with the Muslim community, one of the challenges is that particularly with that community, you don't have a centralised authority. So, I mean, I know that Howard tried to produce what was called the Australian National Imams Council, which is now an incorporated entity, which came out of their consultation process in 2005-06. And so they've tried to nationalise or create a national body, but that doesn't actually reflect what happens on the ground. So whereas, and I think to a lesser extent within the Jewish community, I think they're a bit more united, but you still have different factions. So often what happens, I think, in these forums is that people will speak to the same people over and over again. And what you'll get is you'll get the consensus, the echo chamber effect, where everybody's on the same page and wanting to have dialogue. And yes, we have shared values across the different faith traditions, and that's fine. But that's not necessarily permeating to the wider community. And so, for example, with the Muslim community, you'll probably have a very, as I said, granulated or atomized setup where your local imam is the authority at the local mosque. And that imam has nothing to do with the other imam at the mosque down the road, which could also be very much ethnically based. So I remember a pilot study we did for the current national study I got with the Australian Research Council now, is that we find that these are extremely separate to each other, and you have a Bangladeshi mosque, you have a Turkish mosque, you have a Lebanese mosque, and they're not necessarily talking to each other. For example, in the initial consultation with the Howard government, the Turks opted out of that consultation. They didn't like it. So you had, at that time, one of the largest diaspora groups not being represented in that particular consultative process. So I think this is one of the challenges. So the feedback that we've given in the past, not necessarily been listened to by the government bodies, is that you need to do much more localised, much more granular, much more widespread consultation, where you need to hear what's actually going on from localised leaders. So, because otherwise, if it's happening at this higher level, it's not going to necessarily trickle down. And so you get this wonderful sense of consensus at one level, but that's not necessarily reflecting. And also, those particular leaders don't necessarily know what's happening in other sectors of that wider community as well. So there was a really great article that was done by Sharam Akhbarzadeh and Joshua Roos that called Speaking on Behalf of the Silent Majority, because they didn't know. The same peak body people that speak didn't actually know what was happening in a variety of sectors of the community. So there really needs to be much more widespread, granular consultation and engagement from government at all levels with all faith communities, because only that way can you really understand. And of course that requires huge amounts of investment. So I think that's what probably puts them off from doing it. But that's what we would argue if we were briefing the government, and hopefully what we will be doing later in the year to tell them again what they need to be doing. So does that answer your question?
We have time for one.
Well, can I just
quick
build
question?
on
Yeah.
that quickly? Just, I guess this question about what's the implications of everything you've been saying for the potential for reconnecting with, I guess, political ideas and practices of the common good, of the kind that we've been talking about. I mean, and it strikes me, you know, clearly that all sorts of Christian denominations, Catholic, Protestant and so on, had a key role in the Australian traditions of social justice, of social liberalism and so on through the 20th century. And I guess the implication of what you're saying is some of that's broken down, and this connects to the, to what extent can that be rebuilt? But I guess it's just a tiny, very quick story. In 1990, when the Kennett government was elected, I and a number of other people helped organise an event called the Victorian Community Summit, and Michael Challen, Bishop Challen, was part of that process, and indeed Islamic churches, Jewish churches, Christian churches, and it became a 2-day event at the Independent Church in Collins Street. And I guess in being part of the conversation about how that was put together, at that time, and this is 36 years ago, but there was certainly a strong view that, look, for all our differences, there is a strain of across the various religious traditions which values solidarity, reciprocity, in some senses the common good. And I guess that was certainly there, and possible to organise around at that time. And taking account of all of the points you've made about the shifts, I guess my question is, what's the potential for bringing together voices from these various, both religious and perhaps post-secular strands, who would have a shared commitment to some extent to rebuilding a conversation about what does the politics of the common good look like in Australia?
Well, again, I mean, I think I'd just reiterate that it can't be the same people that keep getting brought together each time, and there needs to be wider consultation. So they need to bring in different voices. I mean, I think also engagement breeds familiarity. A lot of the time, some of these people would have no engagement with those other faith traditions as well. So again, if these people aren't engaging, there's no chance of them shifting the needle on their positions or their understanding of those communities. So. Because time and time again, it's like, oh, we're going to have a consultation and we're going to get X, Y, and Z to come to the consultation. And as I said, they're not necessarily across everything. So it should probably be, I think what you described in the 1990s is fantastic. That's probably setting up to some extent a tradition of practice. But it needs to be roving in the sense that next time we bring in some different people. So some are the same, but sometimes different people. So you're widening the net each time, and that people are feeling incorporated and included and having a voice, because I think otherwise you're just going to have people that feel alienated. I certainly know from the work that we've done with the Muslim community that many of them feel alienated and not heard by governments, particularly from some of the data we've got at the moment in terms of either at the state level, but particularly the federal level. So and that relates to this idea of social cohesion as well. If you feel like you're not being listened to, you don't feel like you're necessarily being regarded as part of the community. So,
thank you very much. That brings us to the bottom of the hour, and our time has expired. Let's thank David one more time for his very